I've never heard of it. Have you heard of it?
Oh, I'm obsessed with Owala. The next time you come to our house, I'll show you my cabinet of Owala bottles that has caused me to get rid of almost everything else and to obsessively want to work at that company. And I admire whoever came up with the idea of color drops because it is the most genius marketing thing in the history of marketing. I put them in my calendar.
Oh my gosh. Wait, so how many
Wait,
do
wait,
you
wait.
have?
Wait, are
I
you
don't
going to
know.
say this is bigger than the Apple
That
suppose
new
it is?
iPhone?
Yeah. Come on.
The
No way.
the iPad Mini, or was that
Exactly.
the?
Well, just
It's right up there.
Oh man.
And I
Wow.
have
RJ,
looked
were you
online.
recording that?
Yeah.
Oh, that's a genius marketing thing, the Owala people. I actually have my own business idea for them, which is that I think there should be a Owala bottle swap, and they should facilitate that so that you could send in a used bottle and get a different version.
Oh, that's so smart.
Oh.
That's so
So
smart.
that you get to keep for 6 months or something like that, and then you keep trading them around.
Yes.
You mean you wouldn't want to put them up on your shelf like a sneaker collector or action figure collector
Yeah,
and
but
have all the?
eventually you can't use them
have
all.
too
But then you
many.
see other ones
Yeah.
that you like, and then you consider which ones are in your stash already. Like, what would you get rid of? And there's no obvious way to get rid of it to open up space to have new ones come in. So I think they should facilitate the exchange of bottles.
I couldn't help myself, but I walked into Dick's to look for something that turned out they actually got rid of basically all their camping stuff, which I didn't know. But I'm walking by and they had this entire wall full of Pink Yeti and other company.
yeah.
Those were Stanley bottles, the ones that leak. So do not get misled by the quality of such bottles. It's Zoji Rushi or Owala and no more. Even the Yetis do not work as well as the other bottles. They don't. So, but yours is yellow, right?
I think what we're saying here is we could get a sponsor, right?
That's what
Yeah,
I
we
was
should, like-
thinking. Yeah.
Because this is Owala.
Oh, we're like twins. Oh my gosh. Cheers, Shannon. Jeez
And
Louise.
I do have.
This
at
is
least,
why we're doing video. We're gonna start getting some phone calls.
I do have at least 6 Owala bottles. Yeah, including.
Do they keep the temperature good for a while? Or
They
I
do.
haven't heard of it
Yes.
aside from Amanda's. What's so special
Yeah.
about them?
Yeah, they keep temperatures extremely well, and they have so many different colors and sizes. They're absolutely adorable, and
And they don't leak. I think that's the key
yeah.
thing.
Yeah.
yeah,
They
I
don't, like-
put them upside down in my bag. I never worry. The only time it's ever leaked is when I didn't screw it on properly.
Oh yeah.
But
Yeah.
but no, they are really fantastic. And
That is awesome.
Are yours all pink, Shannon?
no, I have a few blue ones. I have
Okay.
some of them are themed to things that kind of matter to me a lot. So I have this one, a blue bottle with pink smiley faces on it. And some of them, some of the proceeds can go to certain causes.
Oh, cool.
Oh, nice.
So I like the philosophy of that company. And I think that their marketing people are absolute geniuses.
Oh,
So
cool. I'll have to check them out. Well, listen to this segue. So a competitor of them that's not as good is Stanley.
yeah.
And John was in Stanley, the capital of the Falkland Islands, right?
I was absolutely in Stanley,
Beautiful
capital of
segue.
Falkland Islands. An amazing country. It's still overseen by the British. It's part of the, what do you call it? I guess it's a British protectorate of sorts. Yeah, it's this incredible set of islands. There are 2 big islands. They call them East Falkland and West Falkland. There are 788 islands in total, so there are a lot of small islands. It's at about the same latitude as Calgary, Alberta, Canada. So it's pretty far north, or pretty far south in this case. And it's basically just north of what they call the polar front, and about 300 miles or so east of the southern part of South America.
Nice.
Very cool.
And you were studying mostly Gentoo penguins there?
Yeah, this was a trip that was augmenting some work we'd done 2 years ago, where we went to Stanley, got on a sailboat, and went to the Antarctic Peninsula in South Africa. But we didn't have any time to do any work in the Falklands. And we'd made some contacts as a result of the trip and the first trip. And so we were able to get money from the Pritzker Fund for Meteoritics and Polar Studies at the museum to go back and do work on the Gentoo penguins in the Falklands.
Cool. And should we talk a little bit like about Gentoo penguins more in general? I feel like when we talked last time, we touched on them a little bit, but I've been doing a little like searching and want to hear more about them.
Well, I mean, penguins are obviously a amazing group of birds. I like to think of them as essentially completely aquatic and coming up on land basically to breed. So there's really nothing else all that much like it. I guess there's some birds like loons, which are pretty aquatic, and alcids, the auks and things on the northern hemisphere. But penguins are a really special group. I mean, they're just incredible in the water, but then they come up on land to breed. And so we were down there in the summer. December is the peak of the nesting season, and the interest we have is looking at genetic structure in Gentoo penguins. And it's interested in a couple of different levels based on research, some of my colleagues that were on the trip, some of the work that they've done.
And then do they come back to that same place every year? Do they migrate, or are they always around the Falklands, or?
Yeah, so this is a really interesting question. So they have the biggest distribution of basically any penguin, in the sense that they occur in the Antarctic Peninsula, South Georgia, and the Falklands. And yet at the same time, one of my colleagues who's at Cornell University, Jim McLucas, would always say that they call them homebodies. And that is that in spite of the fact that they have this big distribution, they're a species that tends not to go very far. Some of the other penguins in the non-breeding season will head, for instance, from the Falklands all the way up to the coasts of Brazil and spend the winter basically on the shorelines of South America. The Gentoos don't do that. And one of the interesting ramifications of that Sushma Reddy and Jane Young are two colleagues of ours that were part of the Antarctica trip, and Sushma was with me in the Falklands. They worked with some of their students to do genetic work looking at the population structure between the Antarctic Peninsula, the Falklands, South Georgia, and also Kerguelen Island, which is on the other side of Antarctica. It's another island set. And they were able to show that every one of those populations in those 4 areas were genetically distinct to the point that they recommended that they call them different species.
Oh, wow.
Because they're not exchanging genes based on any of the genetic data that they gathered, and they've diverged quite a bit. And then it gets even more complex because after our trip 2 years ago, Rachel Herman, who was on this trip too, she's a postdoc now at the University of Stony Brook, but she was doing her PhD at Stony Brook at the time. And she used the samples that we got on the Antarctic Peninsula to look at genetic structure on the Antarctic Peninsula. And what she found using genomic techniques is that she could identify colonies as genetically distinct, and suites of colonies that were genetically distinct on the Antarctic Peninsula that were as little as 50 to 70 kilometers apart. So that's a lot more structure than you often see in any species of bird. And the question is, what's going on with that? And that's why one of the things we'd like to see in the Falklands, what's going on in the Falklands in the same kind of situation where you've got colonies of Gentoo penguins scattered across this whole archipelago of 780 islands.
It's so bizarre to think of these birds all go out into the ocean, and they're going back to where they came from, because otherwise there would be genetic mixing, right? So what happens to them out in the ocean? How do they know that they're going to go back? And do they just hang around with the same birds from their own island? Or are they not mixing with other islands such that they're following someone else back to a different island, or that they don't accidentally make mistakes? Because if they really are genomically isolated like that, they're not making very many mistakes, or there would be evidence of either periodic or significant gene flow. So to me, that is it's really bizarre. You don't really think of ocean birds doing that.
And do we know how far they travel? Like when they are going out? Has that been studied?
That's a really great question. And the answer is sort of yes, but there's an interesting caveat. And it turns out that the penguin biologists 20, 30 years ago were doing the traditional things we would try to do with birds, such as mark them. And you could mark them in various ways, like trying to put a tag with a number on it so you could find them again, or a band. And it turns out that none of those approaches are actually good for penguins. They were able to show that if you put a tag on the bird, it absolutely decreases or increases the mortality rate of the bird because it affects how it moves in the water. So they've had trouble coming up with good ways to keep track of individual penguins. With some of the new technology, there was a recent paper looking at the birds in the Falklands where they could put what they call geolocator tags, which are tags that ping satellites, and then you have to get the tag back. And the good news is that in the breeding season, what the penguins are doing is they get a nest site in a colony, and the pair basically switches off going out to feed. And so they were able to put some geolocators on some individuals that were going out to feed and get those data back. And they're going hundreds of kilometers out into the ocean on these feeding trips that take fairly long periods of time. And that's probably fairly typical for almost any kind of penguin. But at the same time, it's, that requires some really interesting aspects of your breeding biology to work out. So for instance, if one of the individuals goes out and doesn't come back for some reason, gets predated or something, what happens? And it probably means the nest fails. So, a single individual isn't going to be able to leave the chicks in the nest and go out and forage and come back and expect to find the chicks there. So
they take a long time to mature too. The chicks, they're not like super precocial or anything like that. So if they're in the nest for 30 to 40 days, you can't starve a baby bird for even close to that kind of time and expect them to mature. So, and I mean, think about it, these birds are almost 3 feet tall. It's not the same thing as a loon or anything like that. I mean, this is one of the biggest penguins, but so the third largest, or fourth largest, is still big.
Well, one of the things that our colleagues found out when they were working on this argument for the species is that they're different sizes in different places, and the Falkland ones turn out to be the actual largest in body size. And we were taking measurements of all the birds that we caught and got blood from. So it was a.
How do you weigh them?
With difficulty. What you need is a good sized bag that's very sturdy, and then a scale like you would, like a spring scale, and we got a system down that would work pretty well. But that would be the last thing we do.
Like storks, right? You're putting them in a bag, and then the stork would be the scale, the spring scale thing. That's crazy.
No, that's exactly what you're doing. And this is the time of year, again, where we timed it such that the chicks are fairly well along, although one of the things that's amazing about these colonies is how much variation there was in where pairs were in the nesting cycle. And in that, there were birds that had chicks that were starting to move around the colony independently, and we had some individuals that were still on nests that had eggs that were just hatching. And so you have to be really careful with that, because you don't want to disturb the birds in such a way that some of the various scavengers and predators that hang around, like skuas, come in and take a baby. I mean, that's, so you're always really cognizant of what's going on around the colony with respect to all these birds that are hanging around, benefiting by the fact that chicks die and other things happen.
I think it's I mean, there's lots of reports about populations both increasing and decreasing. And that genetic work is really important, right? Because we don't know if all populations are doing the same thing or if they're all doing different things. So you can think that the population is 600,000 birds or more, and that's pretty good until you look at some of these genomic lineages that have very restricted ranges and may not be increasing and may be really vulnerable, to extinction.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things about the Falklands, which is impressive, is that there's several groups that do a lot of census work, and so they're doing good censuses. But what's incredible about these Gentoo penguins is they have colonies literally scattered all around the islands. And so some of them are hard to get to. So those censuses get to be harder and harder to do because it's all private land. The Falklands has been inhabited by sheep farming families for ever since the 1850s or so, or even earlier. So Darwin, when he was there on the Beagle, was talking to farmers and things about what was going on the islands. And what was amazing about it was we had an incredible setup with a woman named Giselle Hazel, who was our guide for the trip. And we got to know Giselle because she was the wife of the captain of the Vincent of America, the boat we went on to Antarctica 2 years before. And she's a local botanist, and the two of them own an island off the main islands. And she set up the trip, but we would, the way we would get to some of these colonies is we would get in a couple 4x4s and basically take off from the ranch or the farmhouse and almost four-wheel drive over sometimes seemingly non-existent tracks to go to where people had seen these colonies in the past or knew that they had been there in past years. And Gentoo penguins become really interesting in that sense too. So some colonies are pretty close to the ocean. And then there were other colonies that were probably 2.5 kilometers inland or
Oh, wow.
up to 500 or 600 feet up a hill on the edge of the coast, so that these birds are walking all these distances, even after they come out of the ocean, having gone to feed on this, whatever they're feeding on, which can be krill or it can be fish, depending on what the colony's finding. And they're having to walk then for 2 kilometers to get up to the nest site. And it's like, what's driving that? We have no idea. And those are really interesting questions.
Are there fewer skuas and gulls and stuff like that inland?
I would say on the Falklands, the answer to that is probably not. So you see the main scavengers are an incredible group of birds. So I think it's interesting that there are turkey vultures, which is a bird you can see here in Chicago, and there's a population that lives in the Falklands. There are sheathbills, which are a bird from Antarctica that has its northern distribution in the Falklands, that hang around in colonies and will scavenge on things. There are also giant petrels, which are these seabirds basically that have evolved to scavenge. And so I guess where I'm going with this is that all this stuff could be driving things. There's another bird they called striated caracara, which the Falklanders called Johnny Rooks. And they were historically all over the main islands, but they've been actually forced off by because the sheep farmers are concerned that they'll kill sheep or kill lambs in particular. I'm not really sure. They also go after the caracara. So these are both members of the Falconidae. They're caracaras, but there's striated caracara and I guess it's called southern caracara now, which looks very similar to the ones that get up into the southern part of the U.S. And they're scavengers, but they're kind of persecuted. So those would be inland. too. So it's just, and the islands just aren't that big. So the giant petrels, for instance, you would see flying on almost any part of the island when you were
Do you think
driving
there's a
around.
dominance? Do you think there's a dominance hierarchy that the lesser quality birds get pushed further inland and they're
We've been talking about that. This is on the penguins. You know, did the penguins get?
Yeah.
Is that something? And you could turn it around actually and say maybe it's the higher quality birds that gets pushed further inland. And it certainly
because
seemed
they
to,
can make that march back and forth without suffering as much in terms of fecundity. I mean, I'm sure they suffer as individuals, but
yeah, and I guess talking to Rachel, some of the other members of the genus Pygacellus, which is the genus that Gentoo penguin is part of, along with chinstrap penguin and Adelie penguin. Some of the chinstrap penguins are known to nest inland, but we've now seen some Gentoo penguin colonies in places that just leave you scratching your head, given how far inland they are, and yet, we have even had situations where we would drive out in these 4-wheel drive vehicles for several hours to get to this place, park, and the guide that we had, the local guide that Giselle had gotten engaged to help us with this, who knew the farm really well, would point over a hill and say, they're about 2 kilometers that way. And you'd literally start walking and you kind of play, where's the Gentoo penguin colony? Which just seems crazy to think that you wouldn't be able to know where they were, but they moved from year to year. We had situations where we drove to places that colonies had been and they weren't there. And so what happens there? Maybe disease is a possibility. I mean, one of the things we had to worry about on this trip was the fact that there has been bird flu in the Falklands. And so we were in contact with the local government vet who's doing surveying, and there's some other research teams that are specifically looking at bird flu across the islands. And one of the biggest Gentoo colonies had lost 800 birds to bird flu just before we got there. But again, maybe that's another reason why the Gentoo penguins live the way they do in these scattered colonies, is that's a way to avoid disease outbreaks like this. So there are just a lot of things about what these birds are doing that make them interesting, and they're certainly just incredible to watch.
so the Field Museum's database still has them all under one species. And we have 35 specimens, of which 17 are eggs that John and Sushma have put in the collection from 2022, which I think is really interesting. And then the rest are, a lot of them are from the zoo. So these birds are not uncommon in zoos. So we have 11 from the Lincoln Park Zoo, for example. And the interesting thing to me is, now that they're genomically described a lot better, where do these ones that are in the zoo come from? And this kind of stuff matters when you're trying to understand how you conserve things in zoos, or what kind of mating programs you might be creating for them. We come across this with one of our students who studies penguins. His name is Taylor Haynes, and this is a really big issue for parrot. Did I say studies penguins? I meant studies parrots, if I didn't say that right. And this is a really big thing for the parrot community too, and especially captive parrots, is understanding these dynamics, the genetic differentiation, and paying attention to where the birds came from before you go and decide who to mate with whom. And I don't know if penguins are like this, but parrots are apparently capable of breeding with anything you stick in the same cage with it. Whether it's in the same genus doesn't matter. So
And so can you tell that from DNA, Shannon? Like, where
can.
they came from originally? Okay.
If they're genetically distinct, if there's geographic variation that shows genetic distinctiveness, if they're really genetically distinct, you can pinpoint that with 100% certainty. Otherwise, you have to use statistical methods to say, well, it's more likely than not it came from this population or some other population if all there are significant genetic differences across the geography. But yeah, that's the advantage of using the genomic techniques and then of describing the morphology as well to see if there are distinguishing characteristics that you can understand that you might be able to see with your binoculars. You know, you obviously can't look at your binoculars and test its DNA, nor can you sense its colonies and detect which individuals might be from a different colony. But you can certainly do that kind of stuff with DNA analyses. That's why all of these things are so important, and that's going to come up again when we talk about the feather thief, how important it is to have specimens and to be able to associate a specimen in all of its parts, including its microbiome, its blood, its feathers, its DNA, its tissues. All of these things are really important if you want to understand the diversity of birds, and then ultimately you have to know this stuff if you want to preserve them and conserve them.
And if you go into eBird, for instance, you can find pictures of hybrid penguins. And I think that's, at some level, not completely surprising, just because I do think doing what penguins do, they absolutely have individuals that screw up and get lost. And you eventually, if you find an island, you're going to come out on land. And if you get into a colony where you're the only member of another species in that colony, you might have the capacity to pair up with another bird. And so they've definitely found hybrids in penguin colonies. But in spite of that, I'm surprised how rare it is.
John, I was interested in the predators. First of all, what is a skua?
So a skua is a member of a family of predatory charadriiform birds, so the sandpipers and plovers and things. And what's the family name?
Gulls and terns are part of charadriiforms as well.
Oh,
Stercorariidae. Yeah.
Okay.
And they're these.
They're brutal.
They're tough. They're tough birds, and they hang around the colonies, the penguin colonies. Sheathbills
do they just
are.
eat the eggs?
So they eat a lot of eggs, but they'll take chicks. I mean, they'll take if the chicks aren't guarded, and that's the interesting thing about these. Why do these penguins nest in colonies? Well, in colonies, it's a lot harder for something like a skua to drop down into the colony and grab a chick. Not that they don't try, but the birds in the colony can keep a watch kind of, and that's one of the reasons probably why penguins are willing to nest so close to one another. Because there's safety in numbers in that sense.
Do the adult birds have any mammal predators?
They do, and it's mostly.
They do now, at least.
Well, humans the Falklands has a long history of the sealers. Actually, when there weren't enough seals around, they would actually round up penguins and kill them and put them in pots and get the oil off, render the oil off of them. But in the open ocean, yes. So sea lions and in particular are big predators on penguins. Leopard seals, and so there's down in Antarctica, leopard seals are around every single colony. And you watch these birds go out into the ocean kind of in groups where you think really what they're trying to do is, if they go out as 10 to 15 birds, maybe one of them won't get attacked successfully by a sea lion. Yeah, no, it's yeah.
And John, I had a question. When you're taking measurements, like we've talked about with other birds using like mist nets and things like that, like with a penguin, how do you catch a penguin? What are they, and how do they react to a group of scientists that are nearby?
So the way we catch them is basically by using a kind of a fishing net with a long pole, and you just get it over the top of them, and then you have to basically grab them at that point and hold them by the legs. And once you do that, you can control the wings and the head, and then you can bring them over and handle them for breeding. And they're actually pretty easy to work with at that point. And they do some things so baby seabirds in the procelariform, so like petrels and albatrosses and things, are notorious for actually puking on people that handle them. That's one of the defenses they have. And penguins tend not to do that, which is kind of nice.
Okay.
They definitely they poop on you, so you got to be careful about that. But no, they're amazingly strong, and yet at the same time, once you've gotten them and can control their wings and feet, you can get a blood sample and then get your measurements and let them go.
When
Oh,
you were
cool.
talking about putting them in a bag to weigh them, that reminded me of when I was growing up, when we had to take our cat to the vet, we'd put it in a pillowcase. And like, so when you were talking about putting the penguin in a bag, that's what I was picturing. Yeah, because
And
my
you
cat
can-
did not want to go to the vet. Yeah.
Right. And I will be lying if I said penguins want to be in a bag. But, if you do it right, you can get them in for the 30 seconds or so that you need to get the weight, and then you can just let them go, and they'll go straight back to the colony. And your question about how much does this bother the colony is really fascinating, because the quick answer is not very much. And a lot of the birds we were sampling, I would say are, we're not going to go up to a bird that's on a nest and try to catch it. But there are these other birds that aren't sitting on nests that are in the colony. And one question I still have is, are those mates that have just come in that haven't gone back out to sea, which is probably true sometimes, or are there actually birds hanging around the colony? So Shannon was pointing out that the demography of these birds, in other words, how long it takes them to become old enough to start breeding, is an interesting question. And because penguins have been hard to mark, there probably isn't as much data as people would like to look at a lot of this. But it may be that there are birds that are just hanging around the colony for a breeding season because they're not old enough to actually breed. And some of that's beginning to some new technologies. So there were some folks from the Detroit Zoo that were in the Falklands while we were there doing some disease-related work, and we didn't get to see them, but I know they were putting these things called RFID tags in birds, where you can actually insert under the skin one of these things that basically just like what you use in the supermarket and the department store, where they can run a wand over it and get the information about that unique identifier. It becomes a unique identifier where they can begin to look at some of this stuff.
One of the things I read is that they really are faithful to each other, this whole mating for life. And if you cheat, you're shunned from the Penguin Society, Gentoo Penguin Society. Is that,
Oh, wow.
do you think that could be why there are some birds that are kind of wandering around? That,
Wow.
because I don't think they peck them to death or anything, right? They just kind of
So
tell them they're not welcome.
Wow.
yeah, it'd be fun to get we should get Rachel Herman on and one of the penguin experts to really talk about some of that in detail. What I find is that they come out of the ocean from the non-breeding season sometime around October and start showing up in the colonies. And what I know about this is it sounds like they pair up very quickly. So I don't know. I mean, it's a really interesting question as to how they decide to do some of those things. When you say that they have long pair bonds, at the same time, they live a really dangerous existence where they're going out into the ocean for long periods of time, where there are things like sea lions and that may be hunting them and such, that I wonder what the average lifespan of one of these birds is. So it seems to me it wouldn't be uncommon. And I don't know that mates are able to stay together in the non-breeding season too. That's another thing that may be different in Gentoo penguins than other species that go even further out to sea in the non-breeding season. I think there are a lot of questions like that that are really fascinating about these birds.
I mean, the other interesting thing you can learn from their genomics is the changes in population sizes that might have happened through, the last 100,000 years or something like that. So you can look at the amount of genetic variability in an individual, how much heterozygosity they have, for example, how many strings of nucleotides, the A, C, Gs, and Ts that are all the same. And you can use the distribution of those things to tell you something about what the historical population sizes might have been. So you can see whether or not they've recently expanded, recently crashed, are fairly steady, which is, again, something you want to know when you're trying to figure out how to conserve them, and what other characteristics you might look at with respect to them, and whether or not that happens across all of the populations. So is that common, and is that common not even just in penguins, but in other things that live there, whether those are plants or other animals?
So for many years, the Falklands, the colonies there, people would go out and collect eggs because the eggs are nutritious and apparently taste pretty darn good. That happens a lot less now. But where I'm going with that is, I think one of the things that we have some data to begin to look at now is a comparative sample between the Falklands, where there have been a lot of people around those colonies for now several hundred years, versus South Georgia, where the sealers and whalers were there for a long time, but they really weren't very widespread in terms of their activity on South Georgia, versus the Antarctic Peninsula, where basically those penguins are not seeing humans in many of the colonies very frequently at all. So, what does that, can you, as Shannon's saying, does that track some aspects of what the penguins end up doing that shows up in their genetic structure?
So with respect to global warming and the changes in sea ice, that is obviously having an effect on colonization of new areas, right? So if there's not as much sea ice in the spring, can't they go to places they didn't get to go to before?
So there's some evidence of that. They're certainly expanding southward along the Antarctic Peninsula, which is about 700 kilometers long. So it's a giant peninsula that sticks out northward from Antarctica. And that's absolutely likely to be due to climate change. So for gentoos in particular, they want to have rocky areas where they can build their nests. So they need to have enough snow melt that there's areas that are dry for them to nest on. And you can see that as you get into the Antarctic Peninsula. But then, on the Falklands, they'd be susceptible to climate change too, potentially, depending on temperatures. And I wonder if that affects how easy it is for them to do these walks from the ocean up to these nest sites and things. So there's a lot of interesting trade-offs with respect to how these birds are doing things.
Got to be some interesting physiological things too when you warm an environment that's, generally speaking, that cold, and your physiology might not be adapted to that, right? So
Yeah. It's certainly an area.
You overheat too much or easily.
Because do other penguins like to nest on ice? Because gentoos don't like ice, right? Their colonies have to be on actual land. But are there other penguin species that would prefer ice? Or
No, but they're
No?
a little, but the other penguins are a little more flexible. Emperor penguins are one of a kind because they're nesting actually on flat areas on the Antarctic continent that are sometimes kilometers inland. And so penguins have definitely been willing to nest on those kinds of conditions, but most of the time they're looking for solid surfaces to nest on.
Okay.
So I looked up their names because I always have to know what their words mean. And then I found out something really interesting because the genus name is an obvious thing. It has to do with something about the tails that they have. But their species name of Papua, I'm like, where did that come from? And it turns out it's a lie. It's like scientific fraud that these birds were described as being from New Guinea, but it's not true. And so the Papua makes sense from that perspective, but doesn't make sense from their actual distribution. So I found that really interesting. So they, the people who made both of their names had understanding of what the bird looked like, but not where it came from, for real.
Interesting.
And then I had to look up
a lot of
Gentoo.
that is the result of the history of exploration, where these,
Yeah.
people know the voyage of the Beagle really well, but there were lots of voyages even before the Beagle where people were going around to places and collecting things, and it comes down to how good the data were that they put with the specimens when they got back, and it's hard to believe that you would not know where some of that came from. The truth of the matter is, Linnaeus, for instance, who started the binomial system of nomenclature, was getting stuff sent to him from all over the world where people weren't necessarily very good at recording or remembering where they were.
Darwin didn't record the islands. People had to go back and resample birds in order to understand the islands. So there's all kinds of things you don't think about necessarily, which is why we try to always evolve the things that we are doing with respect to samples, to collections, and the associating all the data that can come from an individual with those individuals so that they have the maximum value that they can have for science and for bird conservation. But, these are big jobs and require a lot of different kinds of expertise. Creating these databases, these relational databases, is not so easy.
And that was one of the things, we'll talk about this in our next episode, but that Wallace was so diligent about, right?
Exactly.
He was really so good at recording locations on everything, and his databases were all included a lot of that, right?
And part of that was because he's considered be the father of biogeography as a science. In other words, what he started realizing was that as he went to different places, things looked different. And obviously Darwin did a lot of the same thing. But once you recognize how important geography is, you start wanting to know how, where things come from, and noting where things come from as you're going different places.
And Wallace came after Darwin, right? So that's something learned, that the experiences and the expertise of other people. Obviously, then they couldn't share it by the internet. But there were still conversations that happened when people went back from their expeditions, letters that were exchanged. And so you get ideas and then you go implement them. And anything that refines the amount of information you get from a specimen maximizes its value.
All right. Well, should we, we'll get into Wallace in our next episode. We do have a mailbag question on this one. Is there anything else on John's trip or Gentoo Penguins we want to talk about before we do our mailbag question?
No, I'll just say really quickly that the Falklands is it's got a pretty small avifauna of only about 45 birds, but it's just an incredible place to visit because it's this mixture of grassland and heath and coastline, and so it's really a beautiful place. And some of the tour boats that are on their way to Antarctica will actually stop in Stanley and some of the other places to see birds on the Falklands when people take trips there. So it is a place you can get to, and it's definitely out of the way, but it's worth a trip.
Nice. I forgot to ask John, was there anything new that you saw there?
Yeah,
that you hadn't seen before?
I got a few new things, which I was really happy about. that I hadn't seen on the previous trip. And it's just it's a really interesting avifauna, and we'd like to go back. And one of the things we were talking to people about in the Falklands, we gave a presentation at the Chamber of Commerce with the goal of kind of saying to folks that collections are valuable. And I really quickly, there's a book on the Falklands that was written it was published in the early 2000s. And the author was a local Falklander who did a really nice job. And one of the things he did was he went around and contacted all the major museums he could think of that might have Falkland specimens. Shannon didn't say this, but we have 25, and Shannon's listed in the acknowledgments for the book as having provided information about those specimens to her and to the author. And what I wanted to point out here was I used that number in the talk to kind of say this guy found 2,000 specimens from the Falklands. There are 45 species or so that are regular. Those could have been collected anywhere between 1860 and today. And what that really tells you is there aren't very many specimens for species from the Falklands for any of the common birds there. And, again, Shannon talked about this. They can document things going into the future as long as they're maintaining collections and accessible to people. And so that was, we'd like to go back because I think there's more work that can be done in terms of getting together some modern sampling for the Falklands.
It's really important with changing the polar regions are going to be where climate change is felt the most dramatic and the earliest, right? So, documenting what was there now before it gets even worse is really important. That's why these collections, these snapshots in time through time, are so critical to our understanding of what happened to birds, what these changes are doing to birds, and then, helping us predict the future so we can intervene.
All right. Well, should we do our mailbag question then to wrap it up?
Let's do our mailbag question.
Okay. So this is Kate. She reached out to us on Instagram. Her handle is Kate in the Studio, and she's a naturalist artist. She has some really great stuff, so everyone should go give her a follow. So Kate says, "Hi guys, I've been an avid birder since college, and as a naturalist artist, I paint a lot of birds for a living. My obsession runs deep. I love the Birds of a Feather podcast and enjoy learning more about birds. I have a massive feeding station in front of our kitchen window and notice that birds love it when it rains and come to the feeder in droves. But wondered, when it's a nasty storm, where do they take refuge? It seems like sheltering in a tree when there's a severe storm wouldn't be feasible. Do they fly away from the area or hide in bushes? Maybe this is a quick answer, but thought this would be a good subject. Thank you, Kate."
Good question.
Yeah, well, they do go into trees. They do go into bushes against the, right against the trunks of trees where they're slightly more protective. If they live near holes, they might go in a hole. They might roost colonially at that point. And if the birds can sense, I guess if they can sense any weather changes far enough in advance, they'll go find places to eat and bulk up a bit, which is what they're doing at her feeder, right? If they're sensing the weather's about to be bad, then they know she has a reliable source of food. They're going to go and eat as much as they can before they sense that the weather might turn against them. So, but a lot of birds die. This is horrible and it sounds cruel, but bird populations are declining. They're not exploding. And that means that half of the birds every year in a species are dying, or more than half are dying. So that sounds horrible and mean, but that's the reality. That's the fate of birds. And so when you intervene on these natural causes of death is when you have these significant declines. We talked about that with rusty blackbirds. So yeah, I know. I feel mean telling people that birds die.
Well, I was going if you look across birds, they do find. I mean, I'm always amazed when you see a hurricane come into Florida, for instance, and think about what a great blue heron. Where does a great blue heron hide in a hurricane? And Shannon's right. In those situations, sometimes probably they don't do very well, but they clearly, even a great blue heron can find places. I'll turn it back to the Falklands and point out that these penguins, if they're on nests, they've got nowhere to go. They've got to sit it out. And we actually had a snowstorm come through while in the early part of the trip. And so basically they're hoping that their reserves and things are good enough, that they've been foraging well enough beforehand that they can sit out those periods of bad weather and not have it affect the ability to keep the incubation going or anything.
That's the advantage of being big, right? You're slightly more buffered from some of those things that a tiny bird that doesn't weigh very much might be. You're not going to blow a penguin on average off of its nest, where you can easily blow small birds away from wherever they are.
John, I have a confession about me and Amanda. When you invited us to go birding last summer, and there was like a big storm that came in the day we were supposed to go, and I think we pushed it back a day or a weekend or something, and we were like, didn't want to go out in the rain, and we were kind of like, oh, is John going to think that we're wimps, that we aren't going to go look at these birds in the rain? And so we're curious, did you go? If you're going out to study birds and it's a storm, are you still getting out there no matter what? Or
So I like the question in relation to this Falkland trip. So the answer in most situations when I'm in Chicago is no, I won't go out.
That's not true. That's not
Not
true.
you. Not entirely
You go
true,
out, he lives with the wimpiest person in the history of humankind, which is me. So,
but one of the things in the Falklands is you've got this finite period of time to get your field work done, and you're basically driving all this way to these sites. Unless the weather is really bad, you're going to go and hope for the best. And actually, we never got rain or snow in situations where we had to stop work. But it was pretty windy sometimes, where you basically could barely hear the person next to you. And yet you're still just cranking through the data. And then the other thing I was going to say is, with respect to the Falklands, is we were trying to get from West Falkland to East Falkland to get back to Stanley. And there's a ferry that you have to take that goes across probably a 3 or 4 mile section of ocean. And we got to the place we were going to go, and the weather system was such that the ferry wasn't running. And we lost the day, which was really nerve-wracking because we had all this stuff we had to do in Stanley to deal with the exportation of the specimens and everything. And suddenly we were stuck at this farmhouse waiting to cross the ocean to get to the other side. And it worked out the next day. But those are major factors in the Falklands. So, one of the other things you can do to get to places in the Falklands is they have an air service. And so we flew out to one of the outlying islands called Carcass, which is really interesting in the Falklands because these are places where there aren't rats and mice, there aren't feral cats. And so the bird life on those islands is much more diverse in terms of the endemic Falkland birds, which is really interesting. But this little air service is basically serving all these little farms across the Falklands. And so you get on these little prop planes that are very well organized and things, but those folks are having to deal with the weather too. And depending on what happens, if a front comes through, you could be stuck at some place for 4 or 5 days if the weather's bad. So it's always interesting.
John has to do an eBird list every day, and that obsession is enough to make him go outside in days when the weather is wretched. Which for me is any day. It's
every
less
day?
than 80. But
all right. Well, I think that's a good point to wrap it up then. Anybody have anything they want to close it out with?
Penguins. They're a lot of fun, and yet the Falklands have a lot of other things too.